I think the so-called peace proposals, peace plans that the Trump team are proposing are probably better for Ukraine and bad for Russia as well. The Russians have already said that they will not agree to the Trump peace proposals. A freezing of the conflict prevents Russia from achieving its invasion goal. And Russia's invasion goal was a destruction of Ukraine, was a destruction of Ukraine national identity, genocide. Because Russia won't agree to the Trump peace plans, that's fantastic for Ukraine. That means that Ukraine gets the benefit from these Trump proposals, not Russia. The Trump team have said, we will provide you with additional weaponry, more than the Biden administration, without any restrictions like the Biden administration put on, so that you get a better advantage in the battlefield before a peace agreement is signed.
Welcome to Talking Ukraine in English.
Our guest today, Dr. Taras Kuzio, is a professor in the Department of Political Science at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. He is also an associate fellow at the Forum for Foreign Relations. Taras has written over 24 books, most recently Fascism and Genocide, Russia's War Against Ukrainians.
Now we have a new administration coming in the United States. Do you have any thoughts or how things could play out? I mean, like part of me is like, okay, well, something's going to change, right? Like somehow the dynamic's different, so maybe that's good. Whichever.
Well, I think it's good. I think it's good in the sense that Kamala Harris would have presumably continued Biden's drip policies, cautious, fear of escalation kind of policies. So we're having two changes. We have a change in America with Trump, and we have a change in Germany with the Christian Democrats coming to power in February. So I think that could potentially change the dynamic in many ways. The Christian Democrats, at least now, we'll see what it's like when they're in power in Germany, have talked about having a far more radical stance towards Russia. For example, demanding that Russia stop bombing civilian areas of Ukraine. If they don't, then they will supply Ukraine with the Taurus missile, which is apparently one of the best in the West. But Scholz always refused to supply this to Ukraine. With Trump, I'm not a big fan of Trump at all in any way, but I think Trump has pluses as well as minuses. And unfortunately, the Western media has focused too much on the minuses as opposed to the pluses. The pluses are that, well, let's go back a bit. Obama administration vetoed sending of any weapons to Ukraine after 2014. Trump did not veto that. Trump allowed weaponry to be sent to Ukraine during his first presidency. Secondly, Trump put sanctions on Nord Stream 2. Biden, when he was elected in 2020, lifted those sanctions. So Trump has a positive background to that. I think Trump was also better for Ukraine because he's going to be tougher towards Iran. I think the Obama-Biden administration was quite weak towards Iran, and being tougher towards Iran means undermining the military relationship between Iran and Russia. Russia could not pursue its war against Ukraine without the support of the Chinese and Iranians and North Koreans. So anything that the Trump administration does, which is tougher towards Iran, tougher towards China, and tougher towards North Korea, is good for Ukraine. China today is the main foreign enabler of Russia's military machine. Why have the Europeans, including particularly the Germans and the Americans, why has the Biden administration not said that publicly? Why have they not been more confrontational with the Chinese and pointing out that you are the main enablers of Russian military machine? It's not the Iranians, not the North Koreans, it's the Chinese. So that, I think, any tougher policies, which are very likely because the Trump administration is full of Iran hawks and China hawks, is good for Ukraine. I think the so-called peace proposals, peace plans that the Trump team are proposing are probably better for Ukraine and bad for Russia as well. The Russians have already said that they will not agree to the Trump peace proposals. Why? Well, because the Trump peace proposal freezes the conflict on the current contact line. That is something that Russia cannot accept for many reasons. Firstly, it cannot accept it because it demands that Ukraine give up all of the territory in those 4 regions that Russia annexed back in September 22, Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, and Luhansk. Russia does not control 100% of any of those 4 regions. Ukraine will never give up the territory it controls in those regions to Russia. So Russia demands that as one of its agreements to join this peace process. Secondly, Russia will never agree to it because Ukraine controls a good chunk of Kursk Oblast, a part of Russia. So Russia will never agree to a freezing of the conflict when Ukraine controls part of Russia. So Russia's already said it's not going to agree to it. But I think the third reason, and the most important reason, which is often missed in the West, is that a freezing of the conflict prevents Russia from achieving its invasion goal. And Russia's invasion goal was a destruction of Ukraine, was a destruction of Ukraine national identity, genocide, to transform what was left of Ukraine, so Ukraine without the south and east, this sort of central region of Ukraine, transform that into a little Russian puppet state, sort of like Belarus under Lukashenko. Russia, if you freeze the conflict, Russia wouldn't be able to do that. You'd have a Ukraine which is still free, so 80% of Ukraine would remain free, and part of the West. Also, a freezing of the conflict gives Russia no major cities. Russia controls, after nearly 3 years of war, Russia does not control a single big Ukrainian city. I'm excluding, of course, the city of Donetsk and Luhansk, because they have been controlled since 2014. But it doesn't control the key cities which Russian nationalists claim are Russian, which are Odessa, Kharkiv, Kiev. Russian nationalists say these are Russian cities that should come back to Russia. They're deluded, they're wrong, but this is what they claim. So freezing of the conflict doesn't give them any of that. It actually gives them 18% of Ukrainian territory and only parts of regions, part of southern Zaporizhia and eastern Kherson Oblast. So, and it does not give them Ukraine's recognition that these territories now belong to Russia. Ukraine will never do that. So Russia will not agree to it. Because Russia won't agree to the Trump peace plans, that's fantastic for Ukraine. That means that Ukraine gets the benefit from these Trump proposals, not Russia. Because the Americans, including the Trump administration, and Trump was just saw Zelensky in Paris, and I don't think it was a coincidence that he was wearing a blue suit and a yellow tie. His team have said that I've asked Ukraine, are you going to be interested in this peace proposal? Zelensky said yes. Russia has said no. That works to Ukraine's advantage. That means that the Americans have said, the Trump team have said, we will provide you with additional weaponry, more than the Biden administration, without any restrictions like the Biden administration put on, so that you get a better advantage in the battlefield before a peace agreement is signed. This is something the Europeans want as well. They don't want Ukraine to sign anything from a position of weakness. It has to be from a position of strength. So I think that game will work in Ukraine's favor. Now, of course, the disadvantage is that 18% of Ukraine remains under Russian territory, under Russian control. But I think that allowing the war to continue as it is not great for Ukraine in terms of casualties, civilian and military, and in terms of the destruction of Ukraine. There needs to be a pause so that Ukraine can concentrate on rebuilding, bringing people back home, kids back to school, all of those things. The way it's going now is Ukrainians are fatigued from this. So I think it's unfortunate. It's not something that is a positive side to this agreement, but maybe it's something that has to be done because as it stands now, because of that change in Russian military approach to Ukraine since 2023, Ukraine does not have the strength, the military strength, to take on those 450,000 Russian troops and liberate the southeast. Simply, it's not possible. So what's the alternative? The only alternatives are to have some kind of peace deal where temporarily those territories belong to Russia, but Ukraine and the West do not de jure, do not legally recognize them as Russian. Or the only other option is to continue fighting. But then the Trump administration would say, well, we're no longer supplying weaponry to you. So I think overall, this is probably to Ukraine's advantage. We shall see. I think the big unknown is what happens to Russia in 2025, because all of the analysis shows that Russia's economy and financial system is coming up to massive crisis in 2025, because it just can't continue the way it's been going until now. And secondly, the rate of casualties that Russia is suffering from simply is not possible to continue indefinitely. So 2025 could be a bad year for Ukraine. Sorry, a bad year for Russia and a good year for Ukraine. We shall see.
Yeah, there's a couple things going through my mind. You're going through all that. One is by Ukraine saying they're willing to come to the negotiating table, so to speak, that gives them a lot more probably, what's the word? Goodwill with the Trump administration.
Yeah.
Where, they may come back and say, okay, Ukraine's willing, Russia is not. Okay, we're going to give Ukraine more weapons, like you were saying, which could play out that way. The other thing is, and you touched on this too, is that there's so many Ukrainians who have fled, women and children and families separated. And the longer they stay out of Ukraine, the less likely they are to go back.
Yes,
as they
absolutely.
become assimilated in these European countries, as they start new lives,
remarried
new
and
partners.
stuff.
And so Ukraine needs these people back, or at least some percentage of the population to come back. And they're going to come back with this European experience to bring to Ukraine, which will be huge in transforming society in Ukraine down the line. So, in that sort of like perspective, that territory isn't as valuable as all these millions of people that Ukraine needs to build its future.
I agree. I mean, there's a lot of downsides to the war continuing indefinitely. And just the social impact of the war is just huge. It's not just the number of people killed or wounded. It's also the impact on children, on young people, having to, do school in underground passages, having to do things online. I mean, they've already had to do a lot of that during the COVID pandemic, and they lost a lot of education then. And now you've got this. So I absolutely agree with you. I think the longer this war continues, the worse it is for Ukraine. Putin doesn't give a damn, how many Ukrainians and how many Russians even die from this. He doesn't care. But from a Ukrainian point of view, it's to Ukraine's advantage the war ends quickly. That is why the Biden policy or the Biden-Schultz policy of drip drip was bad, because it just meant a war going on forever, never ending. The compromise for Ukraine would be temporarily this 18% would be under Russian control, but it would never be recognized legally by Ukraine and by the international community, by the UN. And one day it's going to come back to Ukraine. I think the big sticking point is going to be because, if Zelensky agrees to this, he's going to have to put this to a referendum. I mean, he can't just do this himself. According to the Ukrainian constitution, he's the guarantor of Ukraine's territorial integrity. So he can't personally just give away territory. So he's going to have to do a referendum. And then I think a referendum has a chance of agreeing to this, some kind of peace deal. But the sticking point is going to be NATO. And this is where I think the disagreement is going to be between Ukraine and Ukraine's supporters in Europe and the Trump administration. Because the only way to make this 82% of Ukraine safe and secure from Russia isn't by putting some troops on that contact line. I mean, that's already a big question mark. And which countries are going to be willing to send troops to stand on that contact line between Ukraine and Russia? Who's going to do that? It makes you wonder. But I think if that 82% of Ukraine was allowed to join NATO, as Zelensky has suggested, then that means the war is over, because Russia would never attack a NATO member. And I think if Zelensky was proposing this in a referendum, if he proposed it in such look, we have to do this deal. This part is temporarily under Russian occupation, but we are free to no longer have to be involved in a war in the 82% of Ukraine, which is not occupied by Russia, and we're a part of NATO. I think Ukrainians might go for that. But without NATO membership, you have all sorts of questions rising. And this is where the Trump administration is going to come unstuck a bit. What does it mean, security guarantees? What does it mean that how do you stop Russia sort of, having a break, rebuilding its army, and then trying again in 2-3 years' time? What's going to stop that?
Yeah, I wanted to just throw out this idea because NATO requires all the countries to agree and ratify it. So that may end there, even if Trump or America says yes, right? Like Turkey could veto it or Hungary.
Yeah, but I know what you're saying. There's like 4 or 5 countries, particularly the Slovaks and the Hungarians, who are opposed. But I don't want to offend the people from these 2 countries, but they're not important countries in NATO. What decides this kind of thing are the big players. It's the Brits, the French, the Germans, and the Americans. I mean, they decide. And the 2 countries which are blocking Ukraine joining NATO at the moment are the Germans and the Americans. The French have changed. The French now support Ukraine's membership. The Brits have always supported Ukraine, and the Scandinavians and the others. So it's the Scholzes and the Bidens which are blocking. And in the case of the strange thing about America is that the last US president to support Ukraine's membership of NATO was Bush back in 2008. Obama was against, Trump was against, and then now Biden's against. I think this is if Trump changes his mind and you have a Christian Democrat chancellor, if they change their minds, then the smaller countries will say, okay, that they won't be able to stop it. They won't be able to block it. And nobody respects Orban in Hungary. Come on. And so it really depends on what the Trump administration decides on this. If the Trump administration really want to end this war and to stop Russia again attacking Ukraine, the best way to do that is to bring Ukraine into NATO, because Russia would never attack a NATO member. I mean, that's the reality.
Is there a possibility that they could create another similar military alliance with countries who are willing to do that and not call it NATO and call it something else? Or would that be sort of like another Budapest memorandum scenario?
Well, I mean, don't use those two words, Budapest Memorandum, because they're very, uh, they don't have a good following in Ukraine at all. Ukrainians feel betrayed by the Budapest Memorandum. But yes, I mean, people talk about a coalition of the willing. But okay, if you don't do NATO, and then by NATO membership here, we're talking about the kind of West German scenario. Everybody, people who don't know about this topic say, well, you can't bring only part of a country into NATO. That's not true. In the early 50s, West Germany was allowed to join NATO when East Germany was occupied by the Soviet Union.
Right.
And then East Germany eventually joined West Germany in 1990. So that's not true. This could be the scenario for Ukraine, with unoccupied Ukraine joining NATO, occupied Ukraine remaining outside until eventually it reunites with Ukraine. But if you don't do that policy, if you don't move in the direction of NATO, then the only other option, well, there are two other options. The one option is what everybody's talking about, is security guarantees. I personally don't understand the difference between NATO membership and security guarantees, because in either case, you're still going to have some kind of troops on that contact line. And then the Trump administration is saying it won't be Americans, so it's going to be Europeans, because the Trump administration is saying we need to deal with this war and end it so we can focus on China. That's the Trump administration line. Fine. And we don't want to send American troops, so it has to be European troops. If it has to be European troops on the contact line providing security guarantees, then who? I mean, it's got to be only the big players. So it's going to be the Brits, the French. I can't see the Germans sending troops, and Poles. I mean, and then are those countries going to be willing to send troops to this contact line? So again, and also you're going to have to make sure that weaponry keeps coming to Ukraine. Ukraine's building up its own. It's developing its own weaponry, sure, but weaponry is still going to have to be coming. The Trump administration says if you agree to this freezing of the contact line, we won't send troops, but we'll send military equipment. Fine. But I'm still wondering which countries are going to send troops. The third option, so NATO security guarantees are two options. The third option is, again, what Zelensky has thrown out there, and it's a growing support in Ukraine, is for Ukraine just to become a nuclear state again. Zelensky actually made this comment in, I think it was in Strasbourg or Brussels a few months ago, where he said Ukraine can either join NATO or become a nuclear state. Ukraine has the technology, has the uranium supplies to potentially become a nuclear state. Does the West really want an India-Pakistan scenario in Europe between these? And of course, it would hurt Ukraine's relations with the West if Ukraine became a nuclear state. But the West is hypocritical. When does the West ever complain about Israel having nukes? And yet Israel and Ukraine are in the same boat. Israel is threatened, or used to be threatened, by its neighbors, no longer, but now is threatened by Iran. Iran wants to wipe Israel off the face of the map. Ukraine's threatened by Russia. It's an existential war. Russia wants to destroy Ukraine and commit genocide. So Ukraine has every right in many ways, especially because it feels betrayed by the Budapest Memorandum back in signed in 1994 and ignored by Obama and the British Prime Minister Cameron at the time in 2014. So the West has three options: allowing 82% of Ukraine to join NATO in the West German model, providing some kind of mythical security guarantees, and some countries agreeing to send troops to the contact line, the frozen line, or thirdly, Ukraine saying, well, to the hell with you guys, we're fed up of this, becoming a nuclear power. There's no other those are the three options. That's it. So decide.
Yeah, let's see how it plays out.
I mean, sorry to interrupt, but the fourth one potentially is Russia just being, Russia just collapsing in 2025. The Russian economy and finances look in dire straits. That this high rate of casualties can't continue, so maybe Russia is unable to continue fighting to the same degree. People say that's too optimistic. We grew up in the diaspora with always our parents talking about, Russia's going to disintegrate, Russia's going to collapse. I was always skeptical, but who knows? Maybe the 1917 scenario is coming to Russia next year, where the Russian army says, enough, we've had enough of this. For me, it's unbelievable how these Russian soldiers not only are willing to die in such large numbers, but the way they are treated. They are treated like something you wipe off your shoes by their officers and by their officials. I mean, why do they keep accepting how badly they are being treated, including when they've signed up in the army? They're not giving any training. They're treated like, they are called meat. What we call cannon fodder, they're called meat assaults.
It seems
Just
to
not
me like
worth anything.
Yeah, Putin is the Tsar, and like his word is all. He is power, and like he can do no wrong, and like no one is willing to, like step outside and challenge the structure in any way, the vertical power structure that exists there. It's just like it doesn't compute. It's not in the operating system.
Well, this is why, and it shows to what degree Ukrainians and Russians are so different. Ukrainians have risen up 3 times. The Granite Revolution, 1990, Orange Revolution, 2004, and Euromaidan Revolution, 2013, 2014. The last Russian Revolution, as far as I remember, was 1917. Sure. So yeah, the Russians are sheep still. They're slaves. They're zombified. But presumably every people eventually has, enough. And one wonders when that's going to be. I mean, we're approaching, by the end of this year, it's going to be 750,000 Russian casualties. 750,000. The mind boggles. In 10 years in Afghanistan, the Russians lost 50,000 casualties, 15,000 dead, but altogether 50,000 killed and wounded. 10 years. This is 750,000 in 3 years. I mean, it makes you wonder if this can continue indefinitely. So who knows what will happen in Russia? That would be potentially a fourth scenario. Then if that was to happen next year, Ukraine wouldn't need the Trump peace plan. Ukraine would take back the southeast of Ukraine. So I think Zelensky must be thinking that in the short term, maybe I agree to this, but who knows what's going to happen in Russia? And if the Russian lines start disintegrating, well, the peace plan is out. We move south and east.
Yeah, I'm curious. What's your take on Zelensky as president? Like when he came to power, I really had like no necessarily positive like feelings about him at the time. But certainly since the war has started, he's come into his role, at least on the international stage, it seems to me, in a very surprising and pro-Ukrainian patriotic way, like almost like the society, he stepped into the role the society needed him to be. I know like under the hood, like internally, there's Ukrainians still complain about corruption and things like that happening. But if it had been Poroshenko, say, instead of Zelensky, like, do you think Zelensky was like the right guy at the right time for Ukraine?
Yes, I think you could argue that there's a Zelensky prior to the full-scale invasion and Zelensky after. The Zelensky that came to power in April 2019 was a very naive, very inexperienced. He wasn't a politician. I mean, new president. And he was especially, because of his business life, and I guess social life as well, was very much linked to Russia and the former Soviet Union. That was his field of business operation. I mean, he had made a lot of money in Russia, in his field of comedy and TV shows. So he was very naive, I think, when he was elected in 2019. He really did believe that the conflict in eastern Ukraine could be resolved very quickly by him and Putin just sitting down and talking it out. And I think many people were concerned at his naivety in 2019. This begins to change in 2020. I think a key moment was December 19 Normandy summit between France, Germany, Russia, Ukraine. Putin really believed that and this was the last time Putin and Zelensky have met each other. Putin really believed that Zelensky was going to capitulate, basically agree to Russia's demands, because Russia's interpretation of the Minsk Accords was de facto transforming Ukraine into a kind of a Russian puppet state, a very loose confederation of provinces controlled by Russia through its puppet enclaves, the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. Poroshenko never agreed to that, and therefore never agreed to implement the Minsk Accords in the way Russia interpreted them. Putin expected Zelensky to do that. He didn't. So Zelensky then begins to toughen up in 2020, and ironically starts to become more radical in many ways than Poroshenko. For example, Poroshenko never raised the question of Crimea, and the reason he never raised the question of Crimea, which was never included in the Minsk Accords, was because Western Obama and Merkel, the French and others were always telling Poroshenko, well, forget Crimea, it's lost forever. Don't even try and think about it. Zelensky in 2020 began to raise the Crimean question, and he began to demand that the Russians revise the Minsk Accords to bring in Crimea. And for the Kremlin, that's a no-no. For them, Crimea is history. It's done. There's no negotiation. Negotiations were only about the Donbass, not about Crimea. So Zelensky becomes more radical. He creates his Crimean platform, lobbying organization. I think the first summit is August of 2020. And then he also becomes more radical in going after pro-Russian TV channels owned by Medvedchuk, like Medvedchuk and others. So 4 or 5 pro-Russian TV channels become banned. And then the big radical step that he takes is implementing charges of treason against Viktor Medvedchuk, which for Putin is a slap in the face. Because Medvedchuk was Putin's de facto governor of Ukraine. I think Putin had 2 representatives in Ukraine. Economic and energy was Dmytro Firtash, and the politics side was Viktor Medvedchuk. Firtash was out of the game since 2014, and Medvedchuk was still there, trying to build up a pro-Russian constituency inside Ukraine, using Russian money, because Poroshenko had banned Russian TV and radio beaming into Ukraine. He prevented that. And so the Russians tried an alternative, which was to build up pro-Russian channels inside Ukraine. Zelensky cut that short, banned those TV channels. I think it was 3 owned by Medvedchuk and 1 or 2 owned by others. And then it starts progressively deteriorating Russian-Ukraine relations from about the spring of 2021. So you can see a sort of period of naivety, 2019, toughening up in 2020, and then radicalization in 2021. And then, of course, you have Putin's long essay published in July 2021, which is de facto the kind of Mein Kampf for the Vatican, its invasion plan, as it were, for invading Ukraine 8 months later. So Zelensky is a mixed picture prior to the full-scale invasion. And I remember an opinion poll from December 21 where it asks Ukrainians, do you think Zelensky would be a good commander-in-chief in the case of a war? And most Ukrainians said no. So it seems that I think most Ukrainians, and probably us as well, including myself, were wrong. Because since the full-scale invasion, Zelensky's been very good. I think he made a lot of mistakes up to the full-scale invasion. And one of the biggest mistakes was not to fortify the boundary. It's not a border, but the boundary between Kherson and Crimea, which allowed Russian troops to enter very quickly in February 2022. So I think he made mistakes. I think one of his mistakes is to keep going criminally go after Poroshenko all the time. If it wasn't for Poroshenko, Ukraine would have not had an army in 2022. I did many visits to the front line after 2014. And when I went for the first time in 2015 and saw the Ukrainian troops on the front line, it was laughable. They looked like they were homeless people. I mean, they were wearing different uniforms. Some were wearing training shoes, sneakers, as Americans call them. I mean, it looked like a partisan ragtag army. When I went again, probably the last time before the full-scale invasion, which was 2019, it was an army. It was completely different. They looked like a proper army. So during that period of time of 4 to 5 years, Poroshenko had, for the first time, he was the first Ukrainian leader since 1991 that invested money into the Ukrainian army. And that was crucial. And I don't think Zelensky appreciated that enough, to be quite honest. Since 2022, I agree with you. Zelensky has been, he's fantastic at PR. He has no corrupt baggage, so he can't be. The Western media can't go after him for his corrupt past. He made his own money, didn't make it from criminal or corrupt privatization. He's a great speaker. He's handsome. He's got charisma, and he completely destroys Russian propaganda. He's Jewish, so how can you talk about a Nazi Ukrainian state when you have a Jewish Ukrainian president? So he's been exceptional, I think, since 2022. The Ukrainian Churchill. There's no question. The Zelensky prior to the full-scale invasion is different. It's a mixed bag. But since then, I'm surprised at how patient he's been with Western leaders, because he must be extremely frustrated, particularly with Biden and Scholz, over their foot dragging throughout this period of time. But that guy has to get up every day and give speeches. He goes to visit the troops on the front line. He travels around the West. I mean, talk about somebody with determined energy. So you have to take your hat off to him. There's no question about it.
Yeah, and I don't understand, like, you still have these Russian bots and trolls saying, oh, the current regime is the result of the coup. The current Ukrainian regime in Kiev it needs to be removed because it's the result of the coup. But no, if you want to make that argument, that was Poroshenko. There was another election and Zelensky came out of nowhere to win. Like, there's no direct connection, but still, this is like a major talking point for Russian propaganda.
The only way, yeah, I mean, you see that still going on. The line is that there was an illegal putsch which removed elected president Yanukovych. That's not true. Yanukovych ran away. He was a coward. He was removed only after he ran away, and he was removed it was an impeachment vote, including most members of his party regions voted for it. It wasn't. if according to the Ukrainian constitution, if the president leaves office, he runs away or he dies or he's ill, then the position transfers temporarily to the speaker of the chairman of the Ukrainian parliament, who is the de facto head of state until the next election. And this is what happened. So it was perfectly constitutional, perfectly legal. But from Russia's point of view, they're angry, right? And they're angry for the reasons which are not difficult to understand. This is the second time Putin got egg on his face. First time was in the Orange Revolution, when they supported Yanukovych's fraudulent election campaign, and then the Supreme Court removed Yanukovych's so-called election victory and held a third round, which Yushchenko won. So Putin saw that as a personal failure because he went twice to Ukraine to support Yanukovych. Then this happens again in 2014. They're supporting Yanukovych. They force him to turn his back on signing the association agreement with the European Union. They pressure him or they bribe him, probably both. And then it backfires again because you have an uprising, a Euromaidan revolution. I remember being in Kiev, I think it was the 1st of December 13, where there was 1 million people on the streets. I mean, it was just 1 million people. Forget Russia ever having that. Russia again, or Putin again, loses. And he loses here even more, I think, than in 2004, because the plans were for Yanukovych to turn his back on the European Union and then to be re-elected in 2015 and take Ukraine into the Eurasian Economic Union. That was the goal of the Russian strategy, shall we say. And it worked in Armenia because the same thing happened there. The Russians pressured the Armenian leaders. They turned their backs on the European Union and they took Armenia into the Eurasian Economic Union because there was no Maidan in Armenia. The Armenians didn't rise up. In Ukraine, there was a Maidan, there was an uprising. And so Russia's strategy of Yanukovych staying in power and taking Ukraine eastwards into Eurasia failed. And that was a personal affront for a second time to Putin. And so his revenge was invading Crimea and annexing Crimea and starting this war in eastern Ukraine. So they've had this anger about this so-called putsch, which removed Yanukovych, brought Euromaidan to power. They've had that still to this day. You're right. It's still always there in Russian disinformation, propaganda, in the media. But it was constitutionally undertaken. It was done completely by the rules of the Ukrainian constitution, what happened. And secondly, it was the will of the Ukrainian population. They joined those mass protests. They stayed out there for 4 months, and hundreds of them were willing to die. 100 were killed, and thousands were wounded, defending Ukraine's European choice. But Russia will never accept that, of course, because it can't accept that Ukraine has a right to decide its own destiny.
I'm curious, you travel to Ukraine periodically. Your last time, I think you said, was in this last February. Any takeaways from just, when you travel to a place like this in person, you always get a little more insight, or, these personal experiences, interactions for what's the feeling in society. I mean, any takeaways from like your last time and, there on the ground?
Well, I think that the takeaway is there was I think a change in Ukraine attitudes from 2023 to 2024. Back in 2023, a lot of Ukrainians were quite optimistic about the coming counteroffensive, which began in June. They were very optimistic that the war would end soon, Ukraine would be victorious. That failed for the reasons we've already talked about. And so Ukrainian mood became more despondent, more fatigued after the failure of that counteroffensive, particularly as Russia, kept continuing its heavy assaults on Ukrainian civilians and on Ukrainian energy infrastructure. And then with the arrival of North Koreans and troops and such like. So I think the mood in Ukraine changed, and you can see that also with Zelensky. It changed between 2023, 2024. I think on the ground, what you're always stunned about, and I think this is something you find in Western perceptions of Ukraine, is Ukrainian resilience, the toughness of Ukrainians, the huge volunteer movement which exists. Ukraine. This is a war between a Russian society built as a vertical with no volunteer movement, no civil society, with the top telling the bottom what to do all the time. No kind of, personal initiative at all in Russia. In Ukraine, it's a horizontal war. You have the soldiers and the National Guard at the front line, and then you have a massive civil society volunteer movement standing behind it, territorial defense and such like. It's a very different. It's a people's war. It's a national war, and I think that is something that comes out to you when you travel to there. I mean, I think the third thing is when you go to eastern Ukraine to the front line, you see, and I remember this even after 2014, you see huge numbers of Russian speakers fighting for Ukraine. I didn't see that. I have no longer see that as unusual, but people still find that unusual. We went to see a drone operating unit about 5 kilometers from the front line, kind of east of Kharkiv. And these were all people from the Kharkiv region. Some spoke Ukrainian, some didn't. It didn't matter to them. When you ask these people about language questions, they are surprised you're even asking these questions because for them it's just not an issue. Kharkiv it's always different. You've got, there's a lot going on. I think since I was there in February, maybe the mood has got a bit worse because there's been more Russian bombardments since February. Because when I was there, I stayed in the center of town in the hotels. It was still okay, but now it's probably got worse. But there's still a lot of local support, local business support, local volunteer support for the soldiers. I think another difference you see between Ukraine and Russia is in Russia there's the lack of respect for those killed Russian soldiers. In Ukraine, and I saw this in Lviv. I just happened to be in Lviv during a funeral. Is just the respect for those fallen soldiers. Everybody's on their knees, paying respect. People stop doing what they're doing. They wave flags. They bow their heads as those vehicles with the coffins drive past. You just don't have that in Russia. So all of that is there in Ukraine, and you notice it. You of course notice that people have to get on with their lives. I mean, which means going for a beer, which means going out. You can't sit at home all the time and work. You have to kind of relax and get it out of your system. So it's a strange world. But then you think to yourself, in World War II, when East London was being bombed by the Nazis during the Blitz, I'm sure people went to the pubs as well. I mean, you have to kind of release that frustration and anger in some ways. So I think that what has surprised me and I'm sure many people who visit Ukraine is just the strength of character, the resilience, the patriotism, and the willingness to fight for Ukraine. I mean, this has been an incredible struggle. This will go down in Ukrainian history books for decades to come. How this, it's a kind of a David and Goliath kind of scenario, isn't it? I grew up with the Irish against the British. I mean, it's a similar kind of thing. And you can only just pay respect for that. Um, you you go to see these soldiers, and I'm not usually one for loss of words, loss of knowing what to say, but I find it difficult to say what I want to say to these soldiers because I have total respect for them. I mean, they are they are brave, and they know that they could be injured or die, and so I just tried to help them in any way I could. I won an award in Toronto for my 2022 book called Russian Nationalism and the Russian-Ukrainian War. I won 25,000 Canadian dollars, and I used all of that money to buy supplies for Ukrainian troops, um, particularly medical supplies primarily, and various types of medical supplies. I mean, you know, I what I don't see why I should keep that money for myself. That money should go to those brave Ukraine soldiers. So there's a lot of things that to you I think experience on those kinds of trips. And remember that I'm going to Ukraine with these volunteers from Britain who are all British. These are not you people of Ukrainian background. One of the one of the things we haven't talked about, and it's probably a separate topic, is the quite weak response of the Ukrainian diaspora to this war. In Britain, Britain had the biggest Ukrainian diaspora in the Cold War in Europe. Now it's probably not the case. Now there's probably bigger diasporas in maybe Italy, maybe Spain and elsewhere. But I don't know of hardly any Ukrainians from Britain who are traveling on with these volunteers. I don't know of anybody. Um, these are volunteer groups, and you have to take your hat off to them. These are British volunteers giving up their work time, giving up their money, and they're taking things to Ukraine. They're taking humanitarian aid for civilians and military aid for Ukrainian soldiers. Um, why are the Ukrainians in the diaspora not doing as much as these Brits or Americans or others doing for Ukraine? But that's maybe a separate topic.
Well, I know Ukrainians have donated a lot. Maybe they're not delivering it themselves, but they've certainly contributed and done fundraising and things like that. But yeah,
Well,
everyone does
yes,
what they
but I'll
can.
just finish on this one last point, maybe. The biggest is I lived 15 years in Toronto. Um, and the biggest disappointment, one of the biggest disappointments after Israel in this war has been Canada. Um, the mythology in Ukraine and in the diaspora in general is that Canada is the center of the most powerful, most influential Ukrainian diaspora. Sorry, that's not true. That was the case in the Cold War, but not any longer. The Trudeau government has been a disgrace for Ukraine. It's hardly sent any military aid to Ukraine. People say, well, it hasn't got anything to send because there's so little investment in the Canadian army. Sure, but you can give money. You can buy things and then send it to Ukraine. That's just an excuse. So the Ukrainian diaspora in Canada has not been very influential in lobbying and pressuring the Trudeau government to support Ukraine. Canada's been pretty poor, and the Canadian spending on defense is laughable. The 2% of GDP spent on defense as the goal for NATO members is now reached by it's about 80% of NATO members, finally. One reason being Trump keeps going on about it. Canada says it will only reach that 2% goal in 2032.
Mm.
So Canada, this mythology of Canada as the home of the most powerful and influential Ukrainian diaspora is over. It's gone. It's been ruined by this war because Ukrainians in Canada have not been able to influence Trudeau to do anything. Trudeau is an even worse weakling on an international stage than Obama was. So this war has opened up our eyes to many different things.
Yeah, for sure. I had always had that question. Why isn't Canada doing more? There's so many Ukrainians percentage wise.
There are, but things change. I mean, I think the most influential immigrant groups in Canada now are no longer Ukrainians. They were in the Cold War, but now it's Chinese, particularly in Western Canada. It's South Asians, Indians, and maybe Pakistanis. It's no longer Ukrainians. And plus, Ukrainians don't invest in things like politics. I mean, how many members of the Canadian Parliament have Ukrainian background? Hardly any.
A couple.
Chrystia Freeland is the only one I know of. Hopefully, she'll be the next prime minister after Trudeau, but we'll see.
Mm.
Who the hell would have thought that in our lifetimes, I mean, your father didn't come from the same kind of radical nationalist grouping as my dad, because I came from Britain, but nevertheless, you know, who would we have been to ever believe that this kind of war would have taken place in our lifetimes? I mean, it's surreal to think that Putin has launched this war in 21st century Europe based on 19th century imperialist chauvinistic mythologies.
Yeah, I guess it's still the Soviet Union collapsing and trying
It
to.
is, it is, it is, it is. I always joke that Putin needs to go to anger management classes. I mean, this guy is such an angry guy. But he's also angry. He's not only angry about what happened 30 years ago, the collapse of the Soviet Union. He's angry because Russia's a declining power. The
Yeah.
Chinese can just sit back patiently and wait things out because they're a rising power. The Russians are not. I mean,
He could be desperate. He could make a desperate move because of that. Especially try to
he
project.
could, he
That's what
could,
I'm
he
afraid of.
could, he could, but all of the analysis and expertise that talks about Putin, for example, using a tactical nuclear weapon, believe that it wouldn't work. And it would be disaster for Putin. The Chinese would back off. They would no longer support him. The Indians as well would no longer be neutral. And it wouldn't win him the war. If anything, it would probably be defeated. The American threatened response to a tactical nuclear strike in Ukraine would destroy the Russian army in Ukraine. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure what. I mean, he's already doing the kind of other things. I mean, the Czechs just came out with a report saying that something like the Russians have done something like 100 different hybrid war types of activities in Europe in the last few years. So, bombings, assassinations, disinformation, these kinds of things. So that's going to continue. Oh, cutting cables in the Baltic Sea, all of these kinds of things. So the Russians will continue on that. But you need somebody to stand up to the Russians, and the Bidens and the Schultzes won't take the war back to the Russians. They'll just,
Yeah.
that's the problem. The Russians will get away with as much as they're allowed to get away with.
Yeah. Yeah. Ukrainians realize that. So
Yeah. It's one thing the Russian army invades, but the brutality of the Russian state and the Russian army just beggars belief. The lack of any respect for human life. This is just something that I think has shocked everybody. And that hopefully will end soon.
But they need to really lose. They need to really lose
Yes.
for a
Yes.
change like that to happen in their
Yes.
society. The best thing
Yes.
for Russian society to change would be for them to
Yes. Every
have a
time,
meaningful loss.
absolutely, because every time historically Russia's lost a war, it's led to reformers coming in. The big mythology is that, oh, somebody worse will come in than Putin. That's not possible. Putin is the worst. But anyway, when they lost the Crimean War, the Japanese War, and they lost World War One, it all led to the coming in of reformers, and so people better. So you're absolutely right. The best thing for Russia, and this is what the Russian opposition or the best people in the Russian opposition are saying the best thing for Russia is for the war to be defeated, for they to be defeated. This would be good for Russia and bad for those people like Putin. So I mean, I think 2020 to finish, 2025 is going to be a crucial year in many different ways, both potentially in Ukraine, but not Russia agreeing to some kind of Trump peace plan, then the Europeans becoming more active, and also, will Russia survive 2025? Will the Russian army survive? So I think 2025 will be crucial.
За свободу свою ставай до бою, за свою неземну ставай до бою, всі молитви тобі, ставай до бою, брами неба озвуться громом.